Well, hi, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this very first webinar of this series. We are today looking at the social protection in the context, universal social protection in the context of the SDGs and where we are now. My name is Eppu Mikkonen. I'm the Senior Gender Advisor for the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland. And we have three panelists with us today who you all see at the moment, and we'll come to their details in a moment. Here you have the names on the screen as well. This is the very first webinar of the USP2030 series, and the purpose is really to facilitate dialogue and to bring together experts, both from the policy side and practitioners, and really anyone who is interested in the topic of universal social protection, and finding ways forward, kind of leaning forward from the position that we are at the moment, and looking at the challenges and opportunities. I'm just briefly going to introduce the overall topic of the webinar and the next webinars. This one that is looking at the context of the SDGs will do three main things. It will contextualize the macro challenges on the expansion of social protection coverage and focusing on the global challenges and opportunities that are specific to the SDG context. But it will also explore the concept of the USP 2030 and look at the technical and institutional aspects. And thirdly, we'll also set the scene for the next webinar of the series, which will actually look at the country cases and analyze progress on universal social protection. So if you like, this is the sort of framing, setting the context, and then the second webinar that will take place on Thursday, 25th of July, will look at specifically at the country cases, and you can register for that on socialprotection.org. And then the following webinars that are coming in this series will discuss diverse topics, looking at digital social protection, the role of research in the achievement of universal social protection, financing, universal basic income, and gender-sensitive social protection, to name a few. And finally, this series will also result in a special edition of the Policy in Focus magazine, which is the IPCIG's flagship publication that is focusing specifically on universal social protection. So the contributions of the panelists throughout the webinars will be collected into this special issue. So today, now, what we're going to do, we'll move to the contributions, but just to encourage the audience to send questions to the panelists throughout the webinar. So wherever you are, just send us the questions, that we will really make our best effort to address all of the questions. If this is not possible and there's too much for the time, the 90 minutes that we have, then we will have a Q&A document, written document, that will address the remaining questions. And this will be shared with the audience and will be published in the webinar summary. And that will be available again on the socialprotection.org. You will now have 90 minutes of conversation that I really, as we said, welcome each one of you to engage and contribute to. We will have short contributions by each panelist that is then followed with the discussions. I have some specific questions that I would like to put to them, and then we move to the Q&A session. We're taking the questions from all of you and go through as much of it as we possibly can. And with this, I would like to introduce you to, I will just introduce all of you briefly and then move to the presentations. We have Valérie Schmitt from ILO, Anush Bezhanyan from the World Bank, and Anna McCord. Brilliant. And we will go in turns, and I will hand over to Valérie, who will begin.
Thank you, Eppu. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. So I will start my presentation on universal social protection and explain what it is, where we are, and what's next. So universal social protection in the context of the SDGs. It's a concept that is, I don't know if you see, yeah, next slide, please. So, social protection is part of the SDGs, and it's reflected in 5 of the SDG goals. SDG 1 on ending poverty, SDG 3 on good health and well-being, SDG 5 on gender equality, SDG 8 on decent work, and SDG 10 on reducing inequalities. The reason why social protection is part of the SDGs is because social protection is a human right since 1948, and 70 years later, it's still not a reality. So this is why it was very important to incorporate social protection as part of the SDGs. As a human right, it's of course an end in itself. It means that all the countries around the world should aim at achieving social protection for all. However, it's also seen as a means to achieve other development objectives, such as ending poverty, reducing inequalities, or achieving gender equality, for instance. If you look at the SDG 1, and especially the target 1.3, which talks about social protection, the idea here is really to implement national social protection systems and measures for all, including floors. So a system for the ILO and for other UN agencies, it's not only one scheme, it's a whole social protection, a whole set of measures that will address the question of income security and the question of access to healthcare and to other social services for the whole population. So it's a combination of schemes. It's not only one specific mechanism that will achieve social protection for all. When we look at the SDG target 1.3, there is the reference of social protection measures for all. So here we are really talking about universality. The idea is not to cover only civil servants or only the poor or only specific groups of the population, but the whole population, which means that you need in a system to have schemes and mechanisms that address the question of access to social protection for all the population. And when we talk about including floor for the ILO, and we will go back to the floor a bit later, it's really the idea of guaranteeing access to at least a minimum level of social protection in a given country for the whole population. So it's really this idea of right that should be guaranteed for the population. ILO and other UN agencies are working to support the achievement of the SDGs on social protection, and ILO in particular has, as part of our mandate, we really have the extension of social protection measures for all as one of our core objectives since our creation 100 years ago in 1919. So next slide, please. So where are we now? Although it's a social protection is a human right, it's not yet a reality for the vast majority. We estimate that 55% of the world's population has no access to social protection at all. So it means that more than half of the population has no protection in cases of maternity, in cases of healthcare, in cases of old age, unemployment, work injury, or poverty. So this means that we still have, of course, a lot of work to do. And but if you look at this graph, you can see that this percentage of coverage and exclusion are actually different for different types of social protection guarantees, of social protection benefits. For older persons, for instance, we estimate that almost 68% of the world's population has access to some form of old age pension. So it's encouraging. However, if you look at the details of this protection, in many cases, the level of the old age pensions are very low and don't allow the older persons to live in dignity. At the ILO, we are a custodian for the SDG indicator 131 on social protection coverage, which means that we have the obligation to update a World Social Protection database every year and to provide statistical data on coverage and expenditure for social protection on a regular basis. And for that, we work really closely with many countries by conducting social security inquiries to really try to understand through their administrative systems of the different social protection program where they stand in terms of coverage. Next slide. So this is a very simple but also very complex graph that explains you how we see the extension of social protection in different countries. It is based on years and years of experience, 100 years actually. The idea is really that in all countries, the main or the first objective should be to establish what we call a social protection floor, which is a guarantee for all the population that in case they need to access healthcare, in case they need income security in old age, or in case they need child benefits, they will get them. So the social protection floor is not like a universal basic income. It's not something that you receive every month necessarily. You receive it only if you need it. The idea is to guarantee this floor. How do you implement the social protection floor? You can implement it through universal schemes, like for instance, we see that around 20 countries in the recent years have established universal old age pensions, which means that they distribute cash on a monthly basis to all the older population of the country. So this is a universal benefit. But you can also access or achieve the social protection floor through other types of mechanisms. It can be through social assistance that will be, in many cases, more targeted to the poorest segments of the population. It can be also through social insurance, meaning that workers and employers will contribute to a fund that will then distribute income support for those who need this protection. So this type of social insurance mechanism is really widespread in most countries. The idea is that based on the social protection floor, we should not stop there, but try to ensure that more and more people have access to higher levels of benefits, notably through contributory social insurance mechanisms. What is interesting is that we at the ILO, all our work, and especially the work that we do at country level to support our member states in building their social protection systems, is based on international social security standards that really guide or become even obligations when these standards are ratified by the governments, obligations for the development of the social protection systems. So one of the standards that is very well known is the recommendation number 202 on social protection floors, and we just had a general survey to really understand how this recommendation from 2012 has been implemented in different countries, and apparently it has really helped many governments in developing their systems approach to social protection, meaning that they really want to cover everybody with different types of mechanisms, and it has also contributed to expanding significantly the coverage of those people who are not covered. Next slide, please. So when we talk about universal social protection, we are not only talking about universal coverage, meaning everybody should be covered with whatever is available. No, we are talking also about comprehensive protection and adequacy of protection. Comprehensiveness means that you need to be covered for health, for instance, for old age pensions, for child benefits, for maternity, for unemployment. So you may face many risks during your lifetime, and so you need to be covered in case these risks become a reality. Adequacy of protection, it means that you need to have a certain level of benefits or a certain level of healthcare package so that you can really enjoy a life, a decent life. So for instance, a social pension like in China or in Thailand that is at the level at 50% of the poverty line, of the national defined poverty line. For the ILO, it's not an adequate protection, because with 50% of the poverty line, you cannot live a life in decency. Next slide. Last point, last slide. It's about our universal social protection partnership. So together with the World Bank and the ILO and many other institutions, and now we have 12 countries that are part of this global partnership for universal social protection. We have launched this partnership in 2016 at the UN General Assembly, and the idea was really to have a platform to really promote the expansion of social protection, to promote universal social protection, which is really an objective that we all share, to ensure that progressively or as soon as possible, all the population around the world should have access to a certain level of social protection that would be nationally defined and guaranteed by law. So we have a call to action that countries can subscribe to, and the idea is really that through this call to action, we really share a number of principles, a number of priority actions, such as the idea of universal coverage, the idea of national ownership, the idea of that a social protection system should be sustainable, financially sustainable, economically sustainable. It should also be equitable, meaning that there should be a certain level of solidarity across the system, that it should be based also on participation. It's very important that the representatives of the beneficiaries, of the workers, of the employers are really listened to when designing the social protection system and when implementing it. So based on all these principles and priority actions, we decided to join forces to really develop together knowledge, to exchange good practices, and to jointly also support a number of countries that are aiming at achieving universal social protection. So I will end here and see you later for the questions and answers. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Valérie. That was a lot in a nutshell. So I will next hand over to Anush, who is working with the World Bank and has also been really deeply engaging in the evolution of social protection and USP 2030. So floor is yours.
Thanks, Eppu, and hi, everyone. And thanks, Valérie, for the comprehensive presentation. So which here makes my presentation easy. I can skip several slides so that we don't have repetition. So next, please. So what does the universal social protection mean for the World Bank and why we're in it? And Valérie already mentioned several critical aspects and characteristics of the universal social protection that we also, I mean, at least the World Bank, we subscribe to. And when we were about to formulate our strategy for social protection in 2012, we were thinking about the definition, and we came to understanding that it's important that it's nationally country defined social protection system, so it actually has the ownership in a country and embedded in the country's social contract. And it's a system, as Valérie also mentioned, it's a policy and programs that provide equitable access to all population and protect them throughout their lives against all sorts of risk and poverty risk, of course. And we think about, when we think about it, we think about a range of mechanisms that can address this risk, including cash or in kind, for example, be contributory or non-contributory, but also provide active programs that actually encourage better skills and access to the job market. So when we think about universals, we think about two elements: that everyone is covered, and Valérie also mentioned this, that we have universal coverage, and the benefits are available to people when and where they need them. Next, please. Yeah, so this is our strategy. It rests on 3 pillars, and you see them. The resilience pillar that actually ensures again the impact of different shocks, and on the right side you will see different types of programs, so that pretty comprehensive, and Valérie also has been talking about comprehensive set of programs. So that actually, this comprehensive set that is the one that will ensure the access for everyone, and also the expansion of the coverage that is so much needed. And again, Valérie mentioned in her presentation. The insurance part is to insure against impacts of different shocks, be that the old age insurance or unemployment insurance, which is very important that to have in your, I would say, individual portfolio of social protection that you actually are guaranteed through life. And the second pillar is the equity pillar, where the social assistance provides for protects from against the destitution and poverty. And finally, the opportunity pillar that is actually promoting the human capital and gives the opportunity to access the productive work, which everyone needs to have. So this is the a comprehensive set, next please, that we set for ourselves to achieve, and it well fits with the universal social protection definition and fits well into the SDGs. The one underlying, I would say, cross-cutting and overarching part of our strategy in the World Bank is that the system has to be national, has to have coverage, has to provide comprehensive set of benefits, but also there got to be a capacity in the country to implement. So the policies and programs alone are not enough. So you need to also have the implementation capacity in the country. So, and I'll talk about it later, but on this slide, on the right side, I wanted to demonstrate the comprehensiveness of, in our understanding, how this works together. And when one thinks about having starting or improving social protection system in the country, one needs to look at the whole and make analysis of whole system level, so that it actually understands how it works together, but also carefully analyze the entire set of benefits and taxes and other finances that actually go into the system as a whole. Next, please. Valérie also talked about this, but I wanted to stress a few issues here, and these are in our strategy. That we also see, in addition to having universal coverage, so everyone has an access to the social protection, and having a comprehensive set of benefits that actually do cover all sorts of risks throughout the life cycle, you also need to have the system that is inclusive and provides adequate benefits. Because if you have really a small benefit, it doesn't really make a difference and does not achieve the stated objectives. So here I listed some of the characteristics that we actually see that these social protection systems should have. But inclusiveness is something I wanted to focus a little bit of attention on, is because when you look at the different types of programs, you will see that they mostly cover people that have some access to some formal sector, so to speak, are in school, are at work, are studying, or doing something else. But there is a lot of, and I think in the developing world, it's actually very large proportional population, almost 70%, and in some countries that are in informal sector, in informal economy, working really hard, but then not having access to any form of social protection. So right now we're very much focusing on how to make sure that informal sector workers also get access to social protection and coverage. Valérie talked about adequate benefits. I'm not going to repeat it, but the system also needs to be sustainable so that the financial resources allocated and raised and from taxes or from other resources are actually aligned with the expected program outcomes, so they're reaching their objective, and are also sustainable in the context of the country's demographic composition and economic development. And finally, I mean, I already spoke about our system being coherent, and it's very important for that I'm gonna talk next about the delivery system, so that they aid, they assist the internal and external coherence of the system. But what is important also that the systems in the country are flexible enough so they actually can adapt, evolve in light of changing needs of both the national level needs, but also their individual needs, so that they can easily access when there are some shocks that were not necessarily predictable. And for all that, you need the capacity, as I said, to design good policies, good programs, but also deliver them. So the next, so as I said, the overarching sort of goal of our strategy, if you wish, was to develop, next please, to develop dynamic delivery systems, help develop dynamic delivery systems in the country that would actually help implement good policies and programs that are put in place. And here I wanted to highlight a few things, for example. We in the World Bank and our team are now working on developing what we call the source book of delivery system that will synthesize the practical knowledge and international experience of delivery of social protection programs. But to give you a couple of examples, and you see the delivery chain on the slide that starts from outreach to monitoring and managing the beneficiaries. So about 1 billion people today in the world don't have any form of identification, which essentially means that even if there was a social protection program in their country that they could, by law or by some degree, access, they don't have that identification that they would need to actually go get what is their right, so to speak. And so we in the World Bank actually are very much focusing on these type of things, and because these are enabling systems that actually needed for the effectiveness of this program. And recently, for example, we had a new program approved in West Africa for 5 countries where they will provide their identification for all their people so that they can, and this will be portable across the country. The other one on this, the importance of this, I cannot, emphasize, but I wanted to also for you to look at the provision stage where you see in the green, it says provide. It's extremely important, for example, that there are modern payment systems are put in the country, so that even if you hear the cash benefit, that the cash benefit is not going to villages or remote areas in the, you know, like the truckloads of the cash, which is a risk in itself. So a lot of our work is also focusing on that and on other aspects along this delivery chain. Next, please. So what do we bring to the as an institution to the how do we contribute to SDGs and this USP agenda? Just to give you an idea what the World Bank does, we have investment and policy loans, and for poorest country we have on the very good terms, 0 terms almost. We also have expertise and full-time staff in many countries, I think across 70 countries, where we provide advisory support to the government. But we also focus on the global knowledge product, maintain global public goods, such as, for example, the database of the household surveys that analyze the performance of the social protection program. And this is called the Aspire database. And we're also part of the partnerships that Valérie already spoke about, Universal Social Protection Partnership, but also some few other with the UN system and bilateral donors. So this is what we bring. Next slide, please. And here I wanted to demonstrate what is current portfolio of the World Bank, which we have. Actually, this number, 96 projects in 69 countries, this is already the April number, so today it has already changed, and we have about 70 countries with 99 projects, I believe, today. And 65% of our projects is in the low-income countries, which is a very recent development, because we have made since 2012 a very deliberate effort to focus on the low-income countries. We also work in most fragile and conflict states. For example, we have a program with UN, especially in Yemen, as you know, which is in an active conflict state. Next, please. This is to demonstrate what we contribute in terms of knowledge, and more importantly, the knowledge that produce the evidence of outcomes and results of the social protection program that are extremely important for the policymakers and decision makers to have. So you have constantly have to produce this evidence and feed it to them, so they understand that these programs are actually for the good of the people in the countries. Next, please. So this is just simply to demonstrate where we work on the international arena. With ILO, we work on Social Protection Interagency Cooperation Board, and with others, UN agencies and bilaterals who participate. Valérie already spoke about Universal Social Protection Partnership. I also wanted to highlight the partnership on interagency social protection assessment, which actually are global public good that is available to all the countries, that they can use these tools to assess the systems in their countries, which is exactly what I was talking about in earlier, where you when one embarks on the reform or development of the social protection system in a country, it is good to have a look at the system as a whole in order to make this improvement. So finally, the last slide, again, I'm not gonna repeat what Valérie said, which is the Universal Social Protection Partnership to achieve SDGs and 2030 goals. But I wanted to finish with highlighting the core principles of the universal social protection as we see them, and these are that everyone has to have an access to social protection throughout their life. We all are going to need it at some point. That we have the universal coverage of social protection, that the social protection systems are country-owned, national, have a national ownership, have sustainable and equitable financing, and have people participation and society participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's again just super deep and wide presentation, just really highlighting how ambitious the whole agenda is for universal social protection, as it should be. And then it comes the question of monitoring. It seems that this becomes critically important. How do we know that we are really moving to the intended direction and delivering what we mean to within this the big picture? And Anna, you have conducted a study on the indicators that look at specifically on how to measure social protection, and especially the SDG 1.3 in the context of the universal social protection. So we are looking forward to hearing what you found out.
Thank you very much. I hope this presentation will complement the rather excellent input from my colleagues at the ILO and the bank. What I've been asked to do is to share with you the key findings from a study that I carried out at ODI with two colleagues, Rebecca Holmes and Luke Harmon, looking at different indicators to measure social protection performance and thinking about some of the limitations of the indicator which was selected for SDG target 1.3 in the context of universal social protection and USP2030. Next slide, please. And if you're interested, this is the full report, and you can find it at that address there. Next slide, please. I think we've heard already an iteration of what the SDG target 1.3 is: the implementation of nationally appropriate social protection systems and measures for all, including floors, by 2030. By 2030, achieve substantial coverage of the poor and the vulnerable. And each SDG indicator has a particular custodian agency, and the ILO is the custodian agency for this particular indicator. And the indicator that was selected is worded in this way: the proportion of the population covered by social protection floors or systems by sex, distinguishing, and then a list of different demographic categories are set out. Next slide, please. And what you can see is that this indicator has the intent of focusing on coverage. Coverage is the way that progress on 1.3 is going to be measured. It's an outcome indicator, and it's actually used currently by many donors, and it's readily calculable based on national data. It does require some kind of definitional agreements on what constitutes social protection, which can be an issue because there are differences there in how it's conceptualized. And also it requires agreements about how the concept of coverage is conceptualized and measured. Next slide, please. What you see is that we're talking about here the principle of universality of social protection. That's really at the heart of USP. And the way that the UN has decided this will be measured is by looking at the proportion of the population which is covered. And that is an indicator of the extent to which universality is accomplished. Next slide, please. So then the first question becomes, well, how do we conceptualize this idea of coverage? And there's two ways you can do it. You can either look at legal coverage or beneficiary numbers at any one point in time. And the decision was made to use a term called effective coverage, which is the percentage of people actually receiving contributory and non-contributory social protection, plus those who are actively contributing to social insurance. So they may not be beneficiaries at that particular point in time, but they are part of the system. So this is the concept of effective coverage, and it's an aggregate indicator because the way it's composed is putting together performance on the whole range of different social protection instruments which are in place. And the data is provided nationally by national governments, and it's collected through an administrative survey called the ILO Social Security Inquiry, the SSI. And the data from the SSI forms the World Social Protection Database, which is the basis for the calculation of performance against this indicator. And the database currently covers 183 countries. Next slide, please. Now, there's a challenge here, though, because although the database covers 183 countries, data availability isn't available in all of those countries. So for a start, it's not all countries who are included in the database. And then there isn't uniform coverage of every kind of benefit across all the countries. So for example, child grants, there's only data from 109 countries, unemployment benefits, only 79 countries. So it's an imperfect tool. It's not able to completely capture the nature of provision in any particular country. And also the aspiration to break down the provision by sex and by other demographic indicators is sometimes problematic because the data isn't available in all contexts for that level of disaggregation. Next, please. Then the other way that social protection provision is addressed is through the target 1.A, which talks about the mobilization of resources for financing social protection provision. And indicator 1.A.2 talks about the proportion of total government spending on essential services, which includes social protection. And the methodology for this indicator is still under discussion. As of April this year, it was still under discussion because each of the different indicators has a custodian agency who takes the lead in developing the indicator, but then there's extensive interagency discussion about what the best methodology is and what's most appropriate. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges in terms of developing indicators for the SDGs are very much limited to the data which is available because the selection of appropriate indicators has to be from the subset of data which is by and large available. A major problem is inconsistency of data across countries, and this presents a real challenge in terms of getting a comprehensive and comparable picture of social protection performance. There are major geographical differences in the data available. Also, all kinds of inconsistencies in terms of the periodicity of data collection, as well as issues to do with the quality of data and definitional issues and the composition of the services which are included within social protection. So data inconsistencies are quite a challenge. And this is explicitly recognized in the SDGs. And target 17.18 explicitly aims to increase the availability of high quality data for ongoing monitoring of performance. But I think for us, the most interesting thing is that the focus in terms of the SDG indicator relating to social protection is very much quantitative. It's looking at input in terms of resources and output in terms of coverage. And it's really at the expense of results-oriented indicators, which perhaps are more important. Next slide, please. And the question is, how adequate is the existing indicator to measure progress on USP? And I think it's fair to say that while we've got this broad vision within the USP, and the social protection floor is very much at the heart of the SDGs indicators aren't really sufficient to measure or incentivize progress on 1.3 because they exclusively focus on this issue of coverage. And this was summed up by Isabel Ortiz at the ILO a few years ago, who spoke about the fact that the indicators are looking at coverage, but it's not strong in terms of the adequacy of provision. And I'd like to say a little more about that. Next slide, please. I think the key issue is it's not just what's the coverage and how many people, what percentage of people in any particular country have access to at least one form of social protection benefit. The issue is that not all social protection benefits are the same. They don't all make the same kind of contribution to income security. So reducing it down to this aggregate indicator of the proportion of a population who are in receipt of at least one benefit is somewhat problematic. It doesn't include anything about the value of the transfer, the frequency of payment, the nature of payment. Is it in cash, in kind? Is it fee waivers? Doesn't say anything about duration of support, reliability, eligibility, ability to meet life cycle needs. It doesn't say anything about systems development, which is very much at the heart of 1.3. And it doesn't say anything about sustainability issues that Anush mentioned. And so I think the implication is that there's a need for governments and donors to use complementary indicators in their own work to support realization of the broader spirit of 1.3. Next slide, please. So the question is, where are we now? That's the title of this this introductory webinar in this series on USP. And I think it's quite useful to just have a quick snapshot of where we are. And I'd like to develop the material presented by Valérie. So let's have a look. The goal is to achieve substantial coverage of the poor and the vulnerable, and to ensure significant mobilization of financial resources. So let's have a look. Next slide, please. In terms of the total population covered by at least one social protection benefit, that's our indicator, you can see that in Europe and Central Asia, we have over 80%. And then if we look down at Sub-Saharan Africa, the figure is significantly lower. We're talking at about 15% in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we had a question from the floor asking about the performance of the best performers, and it's actually Northern Europe. And this is a response to the question by Anna Romano. The best performers are actually Sweden, Slovakia, Kazakhstan, France, Finland, and Belgium, who achieve 100% in this indicator. But you can see that if we're talking about low-income countries, performance is significantly inferior to that. Next slide, please. And if you actually look at it on a country basis, you can see that these countries down at the bottom, Uganda, Nigeria, Gambia, it's significantly less than 10% of the population is in receipt of any kind of social protection benefit. So clearly there's a major challenge ahead. Next slide, please. And then if we look at the expenditure, now this doesn't conform exactly to the indicator as proposed for expenditure, but as I said, that's still under some discussion. But I think this gives us a very good indication of where we are in terms of USP and the financing for that. If we look at public social protection expenditure, excluding health, we can see that actually in Sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Asia, Southeast Asia, you're actually below 5% of GDP, compared to about 17% in Northern Europe. So there's still a major shortfall there. Next slide, please. This is the last slide I'd like to show you. When we're talking about the shortfall in expenditure, if you look at the countries down at the bottom, Chad spends less than 0.1% of its GDP on public social protection expenditure. So looking down at the bottom of this list, you can see that we really have a significant challenge. Final slide, please. So currently we have neither substantial coverage nor significant mobilization of resources. It's going to be a major challenge to meet the targets in just 12 years' time. Coverage is trivial in many poor countries, and the challenge is really how to expand provision most effectively to realize the SDG target of ending poverty. And I think this is a real challenge to the World Bank and the ILO and other development partners. Very briefly, we need to think about how we make effective use of the scarce resources we have here. We need to not lose our focus on the issue of coordination and harmonization at country level, and we need a strategy to actively promote this kind of thinking and this discourse. And we also finally need to make a reality of the commitments to donor harmonization and coordination for maximum efficiency, which came out of Paris and Busan. So I think it's really quite a challenge to us as a development community, if we look at these indicators, really thinking about how we might reach them in the next 12 years. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Anna. We have now had 3 contributions that have really opened the field, and we have been getting questions in, which is brilliant, so keep those coming as well. Our panelists can check the questions while we are continuing the conversation, and perhaps if you want to prepare a little bit. In the meantime, there are a few questions, if I may just kind of throw at you, and please don't feel that everyone has to respond to everything, but if there's a question for you as a panelist that specifically is close to your heart, then please please do respond. But really, when we're looking at the SDG agenda, the whole leave no one behind principle is at the very heart of it. And I just wonder what your views might be on the kind of methods of universal social protection and universal social protection, and whether universal approach at addressing leave no one behind might be more effective than poverty targeted programs. Would you have a view on that?
I'd be happy to come in on that, Eppu.
Go for it. Excellent.
I mean, I think perhaps that's not the right way of phrasing it. Is USP better or less good than poverty targeting? I think we have an international institutional commitment to universal social protection. So the question is perhaps, is poverty targeting an effective way of approaching universal social protection? So perhaps that's how we need to appraise poverty targeting and critically engage with it. The question is, does it help us to get to that outcome? And I suppose it's about the underlying vision, because if we say that the underlying vision is one, oh, I'm sorry, we've lost the video there. If we say that the underlying vision is one of achieving universal provision, then it has to be a question of progressive realization. And that's the successful model that was followed in Europe, followed well in South Africa in recent decades. So the question is, does poverty targeting contribute to that progressive realization vision? And I think the trouble is that poverty targeting has become associated with an approach which has much more to do with rationing of access and small-scale provision, rather than having a vision which is about expansion. So I think that's the challenge for us as practitioners. And it depends also how you're looking at targeting within poverty targeting. It's very much associated with the proxy means test approach. The two have become largely synonymous in the discourse. And I think this idea of just targeting the extreme poor can be problematic if we're talking about a rights issue and progressive realization with redistribution and equity. And I think perhaps poverty targeting sometimes implies a somewhat narrower vision. And the focus on using perhaps proxy means test approach can have implications for accountability, for transparency, which can risk undermining community commitment and social commitment to social protection provision. So I think there's a risk with the poverty targeting approach, unless it's clearly being used to promote the underlying goal of universal provision. So I think perhaps I'd like to reframe the question in that way. That might be more helpful.
Can I add something, Valérie?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the question is really about, I agree with Anna that we need to reframe the question, because we cannot oppose universal social protection with targeted programs. At the ILO, we believe that we can achieve universal social protection through a variety of mechanisms, and actually all of them are needed. Social insurance, of course, this is for the parts of the population that can contribute. So this is mainly today for the civil servants and the formal sector workers. However, there are more and more countries that are expanding social insurance mechanisms to the informal economy, especially the parts of the informal economy workers that can contribute to some extent. So it means that you need to adapt social insurance to their own reality. And then you have non-contributory programs that include also targeted social assistance, but also universal social assistance or schemes that are for a category of the population, like all the children from 0 to 5, or all the older persons above 65, etc. So there are different social assistance programs that can be introduced based on different considerations. In some countries, it will be the budgetary constraints, but it can be also political choices to establish, for instance, a universal scheme versus a targeted program. So I don't think we should oppose universal social protection to targeted social assistance. Targeted social assistance is just one type of mechanism that can be used within an overall strategy to achieve universal social protection. However, in many countries, we are facing a situation where you have very targeted, narrow targeted social assistance programs, so for the poorest of the poor, and social insurance schemes that are mainly for the formal sector and some categories of the informal economy. And you have a huge proportion of the population that is what we call the missing middle, that really has access to no social protection program, no social protection scheme, because nobody thought about them, or and it means that you have 80%, 70% of the population that has no mechanism that is for them. So this is where we have a huge issue, I guess, and a huge barrier or constraint if we really want to achieve universal social protection. Thank you.
Eppu, can I add something here?
Go ahead, Anush.
Thank you. I fully agree with what Valérie said, that the universal social protection means that there are multiple programs that address different risks and different categories even. There is a lot of talk about universal social protection. It's a categorical social protection program because it only targets the age, based on the age. Same goes to universal child benefit. It actually targets by age of the child. So I think we have to be, as Anna mentioned, it's extremely important to hear these definitions of all kind of harmonizing and understanding that, you know, these things, the targeting and universal can coexist. Universal is a long-term objective and aspiration for every country to achieve. But when you are facing multiple challenges, if you wish, with the coverage, with the adequacy, and with the sustainability, financing and sustainability, this can be a stepping stone to progressively achieve that universal objective. So that's how we look at it. So the pursuing universality as a goal, but in the meantime, having programs that actually are covering the most vulnerable, and that's exactly in line with the objectives of the universal social protection and the SDGs. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. I was going to kind of ask two more questions that relate to the presentations, but we also have lots of questions from the audience, which is great. So I will ask them, but if you feel that you don't necessarily need to respond to that, but you want to focus on the audience questions, and that is great too. And some of this maybe already has been discussed, because the second question is around affordability, and I can see this is coming through in a lot of the questions. You already talked about progressive realizations and the kind of systems thinking planning, which you will of course have to do in terms of your own resources and the scaling or kind of sequencing of that. So the question that we often hear is universal social protection affordable? And kind of, we don't need to dwell in the poverty targeting too much. You've already talked about that a lot. And whether it's seen as a sort of second best but necessary option or step towards progressive realization, but really your quick thoughts on affordability of universal approach. If one of you wants to respond.
Okay, you want me to the ILO to come in? Yeah.
Super.
Hi. All right, so we have conducted a very extensive study on the costing, what we call the social protection floor, which is about this basic level of guarantees of social protection. So access to old age pensions for a population over 65 years of age, for instance, access to child allowances for families with children, disability benefits, maternity benefits, and I think we have public employment programs in the definition. Anyway, I can check the exact definition of the social protection floor that was used for this study, and we arrive at a level of, if you look at the 57 lowest income low-income countries, at a level of a cost of a social protection for 4.2% of their GDP on average. Okay, is it affordable, or is it, or so this is the big question that we are asking the countries. Of course, this is an average, so it means in some countries it will be less than 1% of GDP, in others it will be much more. But if we look at the average, is 4.2% of GDP affordable? Well, in most developed economies, we are at levels of GDP that are much higher than 4.2% of GDP. So our answer is yes, it's affordable, but you need to progressively expand the fiscal space, so the domestic resources, so that you can progressively finance this level of benefits that is the social protection floor, which means that is really the basic guarantee. And here we have conducted a number of studies that show how countries can increase the fiscal space, and there are many ways, by reallocating public expenditure from some areas to social protection, by phasing out, for instance, energy subsidies and reallocating some of the savings to social protection, by improving the transparency and the sound management, and to increase efficiency of social protection systems. You can also generate savings by introducing new taxes, such as taxes on natural resources. In Bolivia, in Botswana, Mongolia, Zambia, you can also increase resources, domestic resources for social protection. So there are many ways. One of the avenue as well is to really expand contributory social security programs to the informal economy workers, so that they can have access to social protection, and by contributing to it, at least to some extent. And this was the case, for instance, in Uruguay, but in many other middle-income countries. And this, of course, reduces the financial burden on government's social assistance budget. So we can share more examples of ways to expand the domestic resources for social protection, and to progressively ensure that that financing this social protection floor can become a reality. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Valérie. Before we move to the questions that have come from the floor, I wondered if you could say something about the sort of road ahead. So what does it look like moving on? What should we be focusing on? Are there some areas or topics or trends that we are not seeing clearly enough at the moment? And also, is there something that we need to be thinking about, kind of country focus? And I'll just say, we'll come back to these, but there have been a couple of questions that have come through, really asking about the political economy and the global policy challenges at the moment. So when we have our low economic growth and the sort of backlash on human rights, and how do we locate this this universal social protection agenda in that context. And just to say that I'm hoping that actually your response, Valérie, was responding to one of the questions that just came through by Irene Among Lutz, who was talking about low-income countries and asking whether the focus should be on universal coverage or not. But I think the way that you've explained the path to progressive realization gave some answers already. But what do you think? What does it look like moving ahead in the global context that is moving super fast? And is it harder to make the case, or does it perhaps make the case for it?
I can address that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anush.
Thank you. So I think we cannot stop here. We have to actually press on, and we have to continue with common goal. And in the meantime, working at the global level to actually address the challenges that we just identified. Anna identified the challenges of the, you know, like monitoring and measuring, but also there are many other challenges. And what I have been noticing so far that we're actually talking this at the global level among the UN agencies, bilateral, etc. But we do need to start looking deeper so that we move this, you know, effort for coordination and harmonization from the global level to the country level, because that's where we need to actually be achieving. And that is a little bit of a challenge depending on the country. And I think we also need to be on kind of in agreement and realizing and recognizing that the trade-offs, yeah, so that we always will face these trade-offs, where to start, where to expand first, and how to progressively go towards the universal social protection. And I think that I see that the challenge but we still have to work together to address this. There is no turning back, because this is the absolutely needed thing in mind.
Can I come in? Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Valérie, Anush, had you finished?
Yes, sorry.
Great, thank you so much. I like that we're not turning back. Anna, and I think Valérie, you both wanted to come in and respond. Anna, would you go ahead?
Thank you. I mean, just very briefly, that the question was, what do we see for the way ahead? And I think there's two major challenges that we have to take into consideration. One is the labour market context that's emerging with this significant and persistent body of the unemployed and underemployed. 40% of those in the workforce I think in developing countries are now living in extreme poverty. And this data is coming out very clearly from the ILO statistics each year. So we've got a real challenge in terms of the deficiency of labour markets and absorbing labour. And we've also got this massive environmental challenge, which is emerging and is going to become more severe, which is undermining the very livelihoods that people are building on. And I think this makes the urgency for expanding social protection much more pressing. And I mean, in fact, if you look at a time when we had somewhat similar economic context, was during the interwar period. And at that time, there was massive investment in social protection, particularly unemployment programs, public employment programs, in order to stabilize countries for political stability, because I think there's a clear link we now recognize between economic stability and political stability, social stability. And I think if we're looking both at domestic instability and also issues of domestic migration, international migration, then really we need to be responding with large-scale social protection. And I think it has to be something which governments come to themselves through their own political discourses. And we see, for example, in India, there was a clear recognition that failing to address the poverty of the working poor was not only a political challenge, it was also a challenge for social stability. And so there you see investment in the last 10 years in a massive public employment program. And so I think what we need to do is look at how we can support discourses and where governments recognize that social protection is a way to really address this emerging challenge of social and political stability. That's where we need to be supporting them with large-scale programming. So I think it's becoming more and more important that social protection is recognized as having a role to play in global stabilization. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Actually, Anna, I think you were responding quite nicely to Patricia Cavallari and also Dandara Ramos, who were asking specifically around the global political landscape. Before, Valérie, you respond, I'm going to throw in another question that has come in because it may be relevant to this whole issue of complexity. This is from Cedric Bernard, who is asking about mobile populations and whether trans-border pastoralists in the Sahel region, for example, are an example of, and how can we tackle issues that are related to mobility, especially when mobility is part of the group's livelihood. So if I can just add that to the pile and hand it over to you, Valérie.
Yeah. Yeah, so thanks. I will not repeat what Anna said so beautifully. So I think indeed, and our general survey that was conducted last year, and we just had the results this year, shows really how, thanks also to the recommendation 202 on social protection floors, more and more countries are conscious and take concrete action towards the extension of social protection coverage and the development of comprehensive systems, including all the groups of the population, not just a minority. And actually, when we launched together with the World Bank and many other agencies, the Global Partnership for Universal Social Protection, we had identified a number of developing countries that had already achieved universal social protection for at least one or two guarantees, for instance, pensions, healthcare, disability, child grants, etc. So to go back to the question, I think for us the first urgency is really to close the coverage gaps, to ensure that there is at least a social protection for all, and for that there is a need for additional investments in social protection from domestic resources. So for us the first priority will be really in all the countries where we are working, not only to advocate for the social protection floor, but also for financing this floor. And for that, we hope to be able also to work with international financing institutions to go in the same direction. The second urgency is really to cover the missing middle. What I was mentioning is that you may have the poor that have access to targeted benefits. You have the formal sector who usually has social insurance providing adequate social protection. But in the middle, and the middle can be very wide, you have all the informal economy workers, rural workers, domestic workers, migrant workers in some cases that are not protected. So what do you do for all these people? And this can be a combination of social assistance, social insurance. So it can become the idea is that really to build sustainable systems for them. Another urgency is really in the countries where there are austerity measures, to ensure that these austerity measures do not systematically threaten the investments in social protection that have been done for the past 20, 30, 50 years, sometimes based on a national social contract, a national consensus based on law, etc. So that all these investments in social protection in the human capital of the country are not destroyed by short-term austerity considerations or political considerations to overcome short-term financial issues. Then you have also all these new challenges that are raising. You have mentioned the migrations or the mobility. So here we can talk about also labor mobility. More and more people are changing jobs on a more rapidly with higher frequency during their lifetime. You don't choose a job and stay in this position for your whole life. You really change on a regular basis jobs and different types of jobs. You can become a self-employed worker, and then a salaried worker, and then something else. So there is really a mobility in your career. That is something relatively new, and that will require actually a lot of transitions from one job to the other, and also the development of skills that you will need to acquire to get to the next job. And for that, you really need social protection to facilitate all these transitions. And when we talk about transitions, we also talk about more structural transitions within the society and the economy, based on facing climate change, for instance, or the digitalization of the economy, which are huge mega trends that are going to transform our economy and our society. You need also to have social protection systems to help the workers, to help the enterprises as well to adapt to these transitions. Because, for instance, if you don't have unemployment protection in a country, unemployment insurance in a country that is willing to phase out some of the polluting industries and to introduce greener jobs or greener industries, how can you protect the workers during the transition, the necessary transition from a polluting industry to a green industry? So you will really need to have all these mechanisms to facilitate the transitions of the workers, of the enterprises, and the transformation of the economy. Last but not least, when we are talking about mobility, of course, we are talking about migrant workers. And here there's the question of building the social protection systems in the different countries to have a level playing field, and ensuring that a migrant worker who is migrating from one country to the other can, through bilateral or multilateral agreements, have access or to social protection and continue to contribute to the different social protection schemes of the different countries, and build progressively its entitlements, especially to long-term benefits such as pensions, old age pensions. But when you are talking also about mobility, you can also talk about mobility of work without the worker to be mobile. So this, we are talking about, for instance, the work on digital platform where your work is mobile, but you are staying at home. And here, how do you also ensure that a worker on a digital platform can have access to social protection? So this is also the question of that is how to organize social protection across borders, digital borders. But we can talk about that a bit later. So these are a few challenges and a few way forward that I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I mean, there's so many kind of new things that we need to think about, all this change in terms of labor markets and digitalization and so on. We have, I can't believe it, but we only have 10 minutes left. It's gone super fast. And we did have some specific questions directed at Anush, looking at social insurance, but also the kind of African community of practice on cash transfers, and whether that might be serving as a strategic tool for the World Bank. And if I may, I would give you the sort of last step of responding for the next 5 minutes or so before we come to close.
Yes, thank you, Eppu. I actually wanted to first compliment. There are several questions on the dynamic delivery system and inclusion and the pensions for informal sector and low-income countries. And what I would suggest, and I mean, I can address them all, but we don't have time. So as organizers suggested, some of the questions we can actually provide written answers to these questions after these webinars. So I think I would suggest that we do that. On the Africa community of practice that you just mentioned, it absolutely, we find it is a very important tool for South-South learning and sharing the knowledge on the program implementation, and that's how it has worked. And there are now communities of practice being formed in other regions that they can learn from each other. But this is on how to and producing the lessons and evidence to inform the policy development, which is a very important work ahead of all of us to have the social protection in Africa develop and evolve to the next stage, including one of the questions was to what do the low-income countries do where they have these trade-offs about where to start, and that's where the progressive universality is the way to go in our view, where you start, depending on the country, you start where the most pressing needs are. And where there is a large informal sector. This is a lot of work ahead of us on the informal sector, but I wanted to mention that my colleague Mel is governing Africa region, and we will send it to participants, is just produced a paper on the pensions for informal sector in Africa, and both that analyzes the current situation but also proposes the solutions moving forward. And that is an important part in terms of how do we actually make use of modern technologies, the mobile technologies, and developing the platforms for the informal sector workers being able to participate in social security. And there are experiences, as you know, that we can also maybe send you, is the SEVA in India has done a very, very good job in covering women in the country with the health and social security. So there was a question about, does universal mean that everything equally to everyone? But we spoke about that the system needs to be inclusive and adaptive. And adaptive means that adapting to the specific needs of specific groups or specific even individual, what they call the case management, where the individual may need a comprehensive set of interventions to actually address to the individual needs. Now, moving to the question on the community of practice, again, so these are the type of knowledge that the community of practice is actually bringing from the practical implementation, and I think we want to continue that. Any other questions that I missed?
That's great, Anush. I mean, there were some other questions. There was a long list of them, but as you said, there will be a written response, a Q&A document that will be compiled together, and that will include all the questions from the audience that we have had. I think the way that you have come back to the question has been really very broad in terms of covering them. Are there any burning last minute comments? We have 5 minutes before we are closing.
Yes, the ILO, Valérie, I would like just to mention that we are, so this year, the ILO is 100 years old. It's our centenary. And as part of the centenary, we are organizing a global social protection week that is also organized very closely with the partners from the Partnership for Universal Social Protection, where you will, so it will take place in Geneva from 25 to 28 November. So I think it's the right place to announce it. We have a save the date email that has been sent to many of you, but if you haven't received it, please contact us so that we can send you more information. It will have 2 days high-level discussions on financing the gap for social protection and coverage gaps, ending the coverage gaps, and then 2 days of thematic discussions in parallel on many thematic technical issues, political issues involving many of our partners. So it's going to be a very interesting event, and we really look forward to meeting you all in Geneva. Thank you.
Well, happy birthday, ILO. That's great. And Anna, did you have any?
Very old, very old.
Great. Anna, might you have anything that you'd like to kind of close with? We can't hear you.
No, thank you. I just think what's come out of this session is that there's still quite an interesting discussion to be had, looking at the way that poverty targeting, how and if it can best contribute to this universal provision. And I hope in the ensuing discussions, some of the kind of tensions between those different approaches will come out, and we can look at constructive ways to resolve them rather than just carrying on as we are. I hope that this can actually try and stimulate perhaps some innovative policy revisions and revisions to the approaches and methodologies that the different institutions are using to realize USP. So thank you very much.
That's great, a very constructive way forward. Anush, did you have a final pearl of wisdom for us all?
Yes, absolutely. As I mentioned, we actually are working with our partners, including ILO and others, on pressing forward on universal social protection, and we're focusing on addressing the issues of the informal sector right now, because that's a big missing middle, as Valérie has noted also. And you assume there will be different papers and strategies coming out, which in the fall, that would address these issues. And the second issue that I cannot stress enough, that and we will continue focusing in the World Bank, is the issue of the dynamic delivery systems. Whereas, as I mentioned, the large parts of population cannot have access just simply because systems are not in place. The ID systems is just one piece I mentioned, but the capacity in especially low-income countries and the fragile states to deliver the whatever universal, non-universal, but benefits is really focus of our work as an enabler for the universal social protection. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a lot to do, but I can see so much leaning into the future, kind of taking on very big areas of work. So like you said, we're not going back. We're continuing. In fact, we're continuing on the 25th of July with the next webinar that is going to move on from this conversation. And it's going to be looking specifically at the country level work. So taking this contextual work and conversation and starting to look at the country level operational work, and therefore moving the agenda to that direction. For me, all is left to say is just 1,000 thanks to Anush and to Anna and Valérie. It's brilliant as always to talk with you. Also IPC IG, these webinar series are brilliant, and I don't know where people are following these conversations from, but already here we have 4 different countries. So thank you for joining us, and please join on Thursday as well. I will just wish you a very nice day or an evening wherever you are, and big thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to the audience for interest in this issue.